All right. And just like that, welcome to today's episode. As you can kind of see, we are going to be talking mostly about some make or breaks with some AFC teams. So it's kind of the idea of today. We're not going to do too much. It is just me. But with that being said, why don't we start the random team? So the idea behind this is we have a NFL team, for example. This is the Texans. And then we also going to have a random player or coach or front office or some sort of member of the team. For this example, Texans underneath Texans is CJ Stroud. And on the far right, we have the pressure meter. So something out of 10, obviously a 10 out of 10 is like the highest pressure. 0 out of 10, obviously, actually it might be 1 out of 10, but 1 out of 10 is nothing. And then the idea behind this is we're going to say what's the pressure meter going into the season, and then are they going to end up being okay in making it, or do they break under pressure, is kind of the idea with this. So with that being said, starting off with the Houston Texans, CJ Stroud is the first player. I do believe CJ Stroud has a very high pressure meter going into the season. Obviously, you have one of the best defenses in the league in the Houston Texans, and CJ Stroud, who has had some really great plays throughout his career, especially looking into his rookie year, and also some not so great plays, especially the last few years. Even if you look in the playoffs, you know that Houston Texans Patriots playoff game was very rough. I think CJ Stroud by himself had like, what was it, 5 turnovers. So going into a contract year, I do think the pressure meter for CJ Stroud is an 8 out of 10 because quarterbacks are so difficult to not only get correct, but to keep. I think there's a high chance, even with going into the contract year, that he does stay on this team. Therefore, under pressure, I do think CJ Stroud, the Houston Texans, makes it. All right. Next, we have the Ravens. So the player that we randomly or the player that I chose is Roquan Smith. We kind of just recently talked about Lamar Jackson and that whole situation. There's a lot of pressure on a bunch of these Ravens players, especially some of these older defensive players. Marlon Humphrey is another player that came to mind. But to me, it's former All-Pro Roquan Smith. This is a player that at his prime was the best linebacker, for the Bears for the few seasons with the Ravens. But recently, he is under a large contract, and truthfully, this past season was not great from the former All-Pro. So to me, I do again have a situation where the pressure for Roquan Smith is around a 6. To me, about a 6. Now, does he crack under pressure? Obviously, we've seen some linebackers be dominant for years. Bobby Wagner is a huge example of that. But honestly, I do think that Roquan Smith will be fine under pressure. I do think he ultimately makes it. Next team for the AFC, we have the Jaguars. Obviously, my team, and they're a player I selected, could choose from a lot. I did pick BTJ, Brian Thomas Jr. Obviously, there was a lot of talk with the disappointment that Brian Thomas Jr. had this past year. After such an incredible rookie year where he was putting up 1,400 yards, double-digit touchdowns, 80-plus catches, and then goes to the season where he is one of the leaders in drops, goes down to 700 yards, under 5 touchdowns. To me, the pressure meter is not too high. There was a lot of trade talks this past offseason, obviously centered around Brian Thomas. I think this one's a little bit different. I do believe if Brian Thomas Jr. was the number 1 wide receiver on the Jags roster, like bona fide number 1, then I think the pressure meter would be very high. But because it's such a crowded room with Jacoby Myers, Parker Washington, obviously you have Travis Hunter, I do think the pressure meter for BTJ is right around a 5. I think he can be a relentless down the field target regardless if he becomes that bona fide wide receiver 1 like he was his rookie year. I think he has a big use in this league. And I do think the Jaguars are going to use him as that down the field weapon. He may not get as many targets as he had his rookie year. So to me, I do believe this Brian Thomas Jr. for the Jags is going to make it with this pressure rate. Next random team, I have the Colts, and the coach for the Colts is Shane Steichen. Obviously, Shane Steichen has had a interesting career so far. Offensive coordinator for the Eagles, did really well, brought him to the Super Bowl. Recently, in the Colts, there's been a lot of issues, especially regarding quarterbacks. They've had Gardner Minshew, Matt Ryan, Carson Wentz, I think I already said Anthony Richardson, but Phil Rivers this past year, like there's been no connection between these quarterbacks. And obviously you have Daniel Jones who came in last year, and Daniel Jones played fantastic. He played really well for a while under this offensive system, a lot of RPOs, run heavy, allowed Daniel Jones to be around on his feet. Obviously you go and make up a huge trade with Sauce Gardner, and then mistakes after mistakes, injuries, this entire team just collapsed. Obviously, there's a lot to say about this. It doesn't necessarily look promising. I mean, they had to bring back Alec Pierce, Daniel Jones. You don't have any draft capital because of that Sauce Gardner trade. So to me, I do think the pressure for Shane Steichen is a little bit higher. I'm looking at potentially like an 8. I could see a situation where if he is not able to continue just the idea of the scheme itself, obviously, I do know Daniel Jones, there's a high chance of him not coming back for the start of the season or potentially extended period of time. But I do think because the system is very easy with a bell cow running back, a lot of quarterbacks should be able to come in and do pretty well in it. But I do think because the Colts have not made the playoffs in a long time and this team end of the year looked not great, I do think Shane Steichen, the Colts, is our first break under pressure. I think this is a chance Shane Steichen does get cut after, or I guess gets fired after this year. On to our next random team. We have the Dolphins. Now, this one's interesting because the Dolphins are in a situation where they are clearly rebuilding. I mean, I've never seen a team who even the new head coach that they hire come in and say, hey, it's going to take us a few years. They signed so many guys to a strict 1-year contracts. In the draft, they picked with everyone their pick, and they go for guys that had high potential. Younger guys, Chris Johnson, Caleb Proctor, those are guys that have very high potential. You look at their core, Malik Willis. This is a guy that has very limited starts, played really well for the Packers. You look at their wide receiver core, take away their rookies, it's Tutu Atwell, Malik Washington from this past year, and just like a bunch of these, I know they signed a few different guys, but it's a situation where there's not a lot of people who are like on a make or break because they know they have such a long leash with trying to rebuild. So as a player, for me looking over it, I'm looking at some of their veterans, and I was between two, Zach Sealers, who I ended up choosing, but it was between him and Austin Jackson at the right tackle spot, just because they did bring in Caleb Proctor. But I did ultimately go to Zach Sealer as their potential make or break player this upcoming year because they do have a lot of young talent behind them. Kenneth Grant, obviously last year first round pick, had a very up and down season, but they do have various young defensive linemen behind them. And Zach Sealer, who was a former, my gosh, did he have double digit, like 10 sacks one year as a defensive tackle, to last year, certain times looking unplayable. So I do think the pressure for Zach Sealer going into this next year is very, very low because of that very long leash. But even with that 2 out of 10 pressure meter, I don't think Zach Sealer does very well next year. I think his age, play style comes into a lot of this, and the fact that they want to play a lot of young players. So I think Zach Sealer, even with a 2 out of 10 pressure rate, breaks under that small pressure. I don't think Zach Sealer is going to be here in the upcoming years. Now, is that so much him, or is that so much because of the scheme / the future of this Dolphins team? You can argue either one, but I do see a situation where Zach Sealer, to me personally, is going to be another player on a trade block and is not going to be on this team looking forward. Another random team, we have the Titans. This one's, again, kind of interesting. You're full of the team with a second-year quarterback. You have a first-year head coach for your organization. Really young weapons. It was a little bit harder for me to come up with a make or break. My first thought was Dan Moore, their left tackle. Only thing about it is it's a very large contract, and it does not quite make sense to take up that much dead money to release him after this upcoming year. Defensively, linebacker Cedric Gray had a pretty good year, but this one could have been a situation like Cody Barden could be here. But to me, I did decide with Jermaine Johnson. This is his final year of his rookie deal. Obviously, they traded him this past year. They traded for him this past year to be that number 2 edge guy. So to me, I think this is a situation where it's last year in the contract. He may not have a lot of pressure, but can he make it or break it? Does he get a new contract? Does he become this Pro Bowl defensive end that he once was with the Jets? Or is it another situation where you have a injury-prone defensive lineman who peaks early in his career, but is not able to do a whole lot after that? So for me, for the Bills, I have the pressure of Jermaine Johnson, about a 4 out of 10. They're expecting a lot from, especially reuniting with Robert Saleh, but they also know that within his, health, history. He's not necessarily someone that is going to completely, go, without lack of better words, go crazy for him. At least it's not a high risk situation. So to me, I do have Jermaine Johnson. I think he's okay. I mean, this one's difficult. I am going to put it as a break for Jermaine Johnson. I do think it's going to be a 1-year contract. And I think for the next few years, he's going to be playing on 1-year contracts to eventually be up to where he was at one point with the Jets. Next team, Texans, we already did. Bengals. This one is tough. We have Zach Taylor, a second coach. This one's fun too, just because of the idea of there's a lot of players on this Bengals organization that could be in for a make or break deal. We talked about Joe Burrow last week about potentially being a trade candidate after this, between this year. I'm also looking at a guy like T. Higgins, just signed a big contract last offseason, but between injuries and just not being that wide receiver one, you can argue that his talent and production does not represent his contract. Defensively, obviously, kind of redo your entire edge and D-line group, so it's not already a player that for their contract is on a make or break deal. Corners, they went ahead and re-signed a lot of people. Linebackers, you can argue players like Barrett Carter, Zadarius Knight could be a make or break. But to me, this is Zach Taylor. I think Zach Taylor right now, you can argue, is one of the hottest coaches when it comes to being on a hot seat. So for Zach Taylor, I think his pressure rate going into the season is a 10 out of 10. If he does not win with this current team, there's no more excuses. If they don't make not only the playoffs, but if they don't make the divisional round, if this year's Bengals don't make the divisional round, I think it's no joke that Zach Taylor is going to be fired. And with that being said, I do think this is going to end up being a break-it season with Zach Taylor. I don't think him and the Bengals can do it, and I think this is another break-it season. Next random team, I have the Steelers. This is the next team. This one's another interesting because this is another team that's very obvious what they're trying to do. They're going all in on 1 year. You bring back Aaron Rodgers, you go and get his best friend, Mike McCarthy, after Mike Tomlin backs down. It is very obvious to me that they are trying to do one more year. So it's hard for me to pick someone like Aaron Rodgers because to me, regardless of what happens this upcoming season, he is going to retire. So I'm looking at some other guys and I'm going back to TJ Watt. I think TJ Watt is one of the best defensive players in this league, but it is really hard to argue that he did not have a down year, and we could potentially see worse and worse play coming from because of stack of various injuries in the past, or just the fact that players at his position on his own team over the last year and a half have gotten big contracts. TJ Watt is one of the highest paid defensive linemen, and that's deserved. When he got that contract, he was breaking records. He was out for Defensive Player of the Year. But this past year was rough, even with, you take away the injuries, which is very hard to do, retrospectively. But you look at the games that he played, his pressure rate was one of the lowest of his careers. His impact overall on the field was very low. I do have his pressure rate pretty high going into this year. I think it's going to be an 8 out of 10. And truthfully, just in general with this team, I don't think they make it. I think TJ Watt and the Steelers team go and break it in this upcoming year. I think this pressure is too much for them. And I don't think this team has enough talent to truthfully get them to the place that they want to be with their last year of Aaron Rodgers and various other players. This is probably Cameron Hayward's last year as well. So personally, TJ Watt to me is a break-it candidate. Another random team, we have the Broncos. This one's fun because I look at this Broncos team and to me, there's not a lot of players that are on a make it break it season right now. You can argue, and I will be the first one to argue this, that they should have been in the Super Bowl. They went so far with, in the regular season, they were almost unstoppable. Playoffs coming along, and of course, Jared Stidham becomes your starter. Bo Nix goes hurt. And even with that, they were still I think it was 10-7, 10-3 against the Patriots. They were so close to being the Patriots to get into the Super Bowl. So I'm looking at this team, and there's not a lot of players that are truthfully on a, make it or break it season. You have the best defense. You've had a defensive player of the year, in the backfield. You have multiple first round picks. You have Zach Allen, the defensive line, who honestly is the most underrated defensive lineman. He's led the league back-to-back years in quarterback hits as a defensive tackle. Your offensive line is the best in the league. You can argue, potentially need more weapons at the wide receiver and running back, but then you go and you get Jalen Waddle. And if Bo Nix is able to be healthy, then I don't see what's stopping this team, especially with Sean Payton. So I'm looking at a player who, to me, had a very disappointing year last year, even with all these positives. And that's Riley Moss. Obviously, that's their cornerback too, next to Patrick Surtain. And here's the thing. Riley Moss throughout his career has had some really high highs. At one point, he was one of the most underrated corners in the league. Last year, not only was he one of the most targeted, but he also had the most penalties for a corner, one of the most penalties for an entire player last year, which is not great when there's a clear weakness on this defense. So you're not throwing it to the other side with Patrick Surtain. And you have Jahdae Barron over at the slot corner position. So to me, Riley Moss comes in with a lot of pressure. He has some really, really high highs. He's had some really, really low lows. So to me, out of this entire team, Riley Moss comes in with a lot of pressure. Can he truly become that cornerback 2 on this team? Or is he going to be another player that's going to be just rotating in and out of corners at this Denver Broncos have had for years? So it's difficult because you look at Riley Moss and it's not a situation where he has a bunch of, athletic ability, athletic upside. I think he's almost hit his ceiling as a player. And honestly, I do think Riley Moss for the Denver Broncos is not going to make it. He's going to break you when it comes to the pressure meter this upcoming year. Next team, I have the Raiders. This was another situation where it's a very young team. They obviously just had their first overall pick with Fernando Mendoza. This team is not looking to compete right away. So it's not going to be a lot of players that are looking at their pressure meter. So I went with the guy who had a very underwhelming rookie year with Ashton Genty. Obviously, Ashton Genty is a phenomenal player, one of the greatest running backs in college football, one of the greatest prospects. Only reason why I did throw him on here is the fact that not only did he have a slightly underperforming rookie running back season, and yes, I'm right there with you. It does come down to play calling, offensive line, the fact that there was no passing game with the Raiders last year, so it was all kind of Ashton Genty. I completely understand. But you look at this team and their offensive line did upgrade. You bring in Tyler Linderbaum, who is the best run blocking center. Colton Miller should be fully healthy this upcoming year. So you do have pieces that can potentially upgrade this offensive line. You also bring in Clint Kubiak, who was the offensive coordinator for the Seahawks this past year. And if you didn't know, the Seahawks led the league in running percentage last year at an over 50% rate. This is the only team in the league that had over a 50% tick and running, which you might think that it was negative towards their offense, but they won the Super Bowl. So you bring in a guy who loves to run the ball with a true bell cow running back like Ashton Genty with an upgraded offensive line. There really shouldn't be any excuse for Ashton Genty not to have a fantastic year. But that's the situation, is there's a lot of pressure on him because you bring in a rookie quarterback like Fernando Mendoza, you're going to be expected to run the ball. And especially because there's been a lot of comparisons between Ashton Genty and various Raiders running back that not always have done so well. I'm looking at Darren McFadden as a former example, first round pick that was very disappointing for the Raiders as his career. I do think Ashton Genty is going to have a really good year this year. I mean, I don't see why he wouldn't. You look at this Raiders team and yes, Brock Bowers is one of the best tight ends in the league, but you look at this receiving core and it's not great. Jalen Naylor, Trey Tucker. I think they might even still have Tyler Lockett on their team. Not Tyquan Thornton. There's just not a lot of weapons outside of Ashton Genty. So I know there's been a little bit of talk of him potentially being a split carry running back, but to me, Ashton Genty should be, a top running back in this upcoming year, just strictly because of the new system. Obviously, he's not going to have Chip Kelly as his offensive coordinator anymore and upgrade the offensive line. And just the fact that there's so much pressure on him that he should be able to turn into a diamond. So with that being said, the pressure rate to me is going to be about a 6 out of 10. Only reason why I'm not going higher is the fact that, yes, he is still a lot younger, only going to his second year. But I do think he makes it this upcoming year. I do think because of what I've said, what I just finished saying, new offense, the passing game being with the rookie may not be as explosive, receivers not being great. And then they made a few upgrades to their defense as well that I do think they'll be closer into some games. So with that being said, I do think Ashton Genty, who is on a little bit of pressure, is going to be able to succeed this next upcoming season. For my next AFC team, here we go. We have the Cleveland Browns. This one honestly was difficult for me because there's a lot of players that I could have potentially, a lot of players or coaches that I could have potentially put on here. You look strictly in just the quarterback room, I could have put both Deshaun Watson and Shedeur Sanders. Deshaun Watson obviously is looking like the quarterback one out of camp right now. Obviously, he has the very big contract and the offseason or off the field issues. Can he come back from the injuries he suffered in the past? Can he be, the quarterback that he once was? I think that's a lot of pressure on him. Shedeur as well. I think the sad thing about this situation is if Shedeur Sanders can't beat Deshaun Watson to be the quarterback one, then there's not any other quarterbacks in this league that he can potentially beat out to be the top quarterback. At the same time, you look at some other players on offense. Their offensive line is all brand new, so there's not really anyone for me that's going to be a make or break. Tight end, you have a young star in Harold Fannin. Quinyon Junkins is a very good, young, quality running back. Defense, obviously, shipped away Myles Garrett. Jared Verse, I think he's going to come in. He's going to be a stud. Now, Jared Verse is a player that his box score does not always represent the impact that he brings on the field. Year after year, he's won the highest pressure rate edge rushers, but he does have issues, completing those sacks. But to me, looking at this whole team, it's Todd Monken as the head coach that's going to be the pressure meter. Just because of this, there's already been a lot of internal conflicts with Todd Monken. Biggest one was a lot of players were disappointed that Todd Monken became the new head coach. A lot of people loved who they already had in the building, especially the defensive coordinator. And because you bring in Todd Monken with his all-new staff, you wipe out the staff that's currently there with the Browns. Obviously, seems like Todd Monken favors Deshaun Watson more than Shedeur Sanders, which is going to bring a lot of pressure to him as well as fans. Just the fact that there's not a clear quarterback one is not great. And, Todd Monken has had a very up and down career as a coordinator. And he's older, and this team is not ready for, to compete right now. They need a young head coach. And James and I, who's not here, has been saying this for this entire offseason, is the Browns need a young up-and-coming coordinator to be their longtime coach, not this older guy who doesn't have this experience of being a head coach like Todd Monken. He may not have, 5 years under his belt to get this team to potentially be in the playoffs. So to me, it is his first year of being a head coach. But out of all the first-time head coaches in the league right now, I do think Todd Monken has the highest pressure rate. And I think it's a high chance of Todd Monken not making it, strictly just because the internal conflicts of not knowing your quarterback, of the disruptive, connections, especially with your defense. I'm not saying Todd Monken's the sole reason why Myles Garrett wanted to get out of there, but it is a big reason why he was not happy, in the offseason. So I think the pressure for Todd Monken is extremely high. I just don't think he makes it. I think Todd Monken is a one and done head coach next year. For the next team, you've already done the Steelers, you're just at the Browns. We have the Patriots. This one is interesting to me. Obviously, Patriots just lost the Super Bowl. They have one of the best rosters. They also just went in, they grabbed both Romeo Doubs and A.J. Brown. They swapped Clayvon Chason for Draymond Jones. They swapped Jalen Hawkins for Kevin Byard. On paper, this team should be better. On paper, you're going into the next year of Drake May, you're expecting another huge jump. Trayvon Henderson in the running back room, you're expecting a big jump from him. But to me, the guy that has the most pressure right now is Mike Vrabel. And that is strictly because of all this drama in the offseason. I'm not one to get into, what I don't know. So I'm not going to necessarily get into all the nitty-gritty details of this offseason with Mike Vrabel. At this point, a lot of people know there's been some situations with a certain reporter. There's also been situations that he has potentially lost the team. So yes, even though he was a Coach of the Year candidate last year, actually he might have won it. Or no, he was second. He was Coach of the Year candidate. This team just made it to the Super Bowl. And this team got better. I still think he's on this pressure meter. And to me, it comes to this. This Patriots organization has had coaches in the past, or a coach in Bill Belichick, who have had offseason issues, who have had situations regarding the league. Now I'm thinking of Spygate, I'm thinking of Deflategate, where they've had negative media attention. And Robert Kraft, who's an outspoken owner, has never been a fan of this. And I think because of this offseason stuff coming from Mike Vrabel, that I don't think anyone, especially Robert Kraft, is liking this. And I can see a situation where if they don't make it to, maybe not necessarily make it to Super Bowl, back to Super Bowl, but if they are not trending in the right direction again, and Mike Vrabel and his team don't make the playoffs or have a very disappointing season, I think this is a chance where Mike Vrabel is out of here. I do think this roster is still really good. I think they still have a high chance of making the Super Bowl. I think their biggest thing that is against them is the fact that their schedule this year is going to be significantly harder than last year. And they had some pretty not easy wins going into the season, but they also had a very easy schedule going to the postseason. And if they become a disappointing team this year with a harder schedule, even with a better team, I do think Mike Vrabel will be the first one to go. So I think the pressure meter for me is going to stay right about a 5 out of 10. Because before this offseason, it was a 0 out of 10. But because of the offseason antics, it is a 5 out of 10. But I do think he's a fantastic coach. I do think he embodies the Patriots way. So I do think the Patriots become a really good team this year. I don't necessarily know if they make it back to the Super Bowl. They aren't my favorites to make it, but I do think they make the playoffs. I do think Mike Vrabel makes it under this pressure. Going to the next team, we have the New York Jets. This is another interesting one. Honestly, all these teams are very interesting for different points of views. The Jets have a lot of players that are under the pressure meter. You can look at Geno Smith, their quarterback that they brought in. They have various pieces on defense that are, right there with high pressure this upcoming season. But to me, no one has it more than second-year head coach Aaron Glenn. This is a defensive-minded head coach that comes into a team that desperately needs a identity on defense, and a guy who is so good, who was a former first-round pick to the Jets at corner, comes into a defense, breaks records by not having a defensive turnover. As a defensive-minded head coach, unheard of. Obviously, that's a record that has never happened before. So there's even been talks of Aaron Glenn potentially being a 1-year, one and done head coach. I do think a lot of the decisions that the Jets made this offseason were strictly because Aaron Glenn was doing his best to keep his job. I'm looking at Geno Smith. There's no reason why they should have gone and grabbed Geno Smith. Geno Smith was one of the, if not the worst quarterback last year. If you argue with me, then his team got the first overall pick to draft his replacement. I just don't understand what the Jets' mentality was, other than the fact that Aaron Glenn was trying to upgrade the roster for minimal growth next season to do enough to keep his job, comparative to letting rookies and younger guys that may not have had as much opportunities, kind of like what the Dolphins are doing right now, and seeing what they have. But the reason I'm not doing that is because Aaron Glenn's afraid of losing his job. So to me, I do think Aaron Glenn's pressure meter is very high. I want to say about an 8 out of 10. And I do think that if this team is anything like it was last year, they're getting blown out. If they're not having sustainable winning, not only winning games, but a sustainable culture, then Aaron Glenn is gone. I do think Aaron Glenn is not a great head coach. I think he is a fantastic person. I think he brings in a lot of, savvy attitude into this team that they desperately need. I'm just very unsure to the fact that he is their long-term answer. Even though I like him as a coach, I do think Aaron Glenn breaks under pressure this upcoming year. The next team we have is the Chiefs. This one, Chiefs are in a very difficult situation. Obviously, the Chiefs are coming off a very disappointing season, and to make the season even more disappointing was a week 15. One of the last weeks, Patrick Mahomes goes down with a very severe ACL injury, which then leads to a bigger losing streak. They have various quarterbacks come in. Gardner Minshew hurts his leg. Olagkan comes in quarterback. This team did not look great last year. This offseason, they made a lot of moves, but they were kind of equal in everything. They traded away Trent McDuffie. They could not re-sign Jalen Watson. They weren't able to keep Brian Cook. They had to get rid of, or they got rid of Jawan Taylor. Like, there's a lot of things, but then they did go and they get, Kenneth Walker. They draft both Peter Woods and Mansur Delane in the first round. So this team made a lot of moves. The only thing, there's a few other points. I am unsure if this if this Chiefs team is going to even be competitive next year. Not because they don't have the talent, because I don't know if Patrick Mahomes is going to be able to play his normal playing style. He got injured in December of last year. A normal ACL injury takes about a full year to be 100%. Some people come in a little bit early, some people come a little late. But at the same time, we've seen players come in early and have completely made their injuries significantly worse. I'm thinking like, you have Tariq Cohen, you have Robert Griffin, you have a lot of these players that played injured and had significant worse injuries. It's stated right now that Patrick Mahomes is practicing with only about half a year pretty much after his ACL tear. And so it's saying that he will be the day one starter. So I mentioned this on our last podcast and on a clip earlier this week that even if Mahomes plays week 1, this roster around itself is not talented enough to let Mahomes just kind of float until potentially week 10. And part of that is Xavier Worthy. Xavier Worthy is a former first-round pick. He has the record for the fastest 40-yard dash. He is supposed to be the Tyreek Hill replacement. Between some injuries, between inconsistency, Xavier Worthy has been closer to John Ross than Tyreek Hill. And it seems like Xavier Worthy has the speed on paper, but he doesn't have the game speed that you really need from this type of player. So I can see a situation where Xavier Worthy, this is the whole thing is Xavier Worthy was getting outplayed by Tyquan Thornton last year. Tyquan Thornton was a guy who couldn't even make the Patriots wide receiving core a few years ago, from Baylor. So I would not be surprised if Xavier Worthy comes in with a very high pressure meter and fails in this upcoming season. So I think Xavier Worthy's pressure meter is about a 7. And I don't think he's their long-term answer at that speed wide receiver. So to me, Xavier Worthy is another break from the Chiefs. Next team, I think we've done pretty well so far. We've gone through a bunch of teams. Let's see, is there any that we have not touched? Wow, look at that. We have officially gone through every team. But yeah, that's the biggest thing is like, obviously it's still the offseason and a lot of these teams, actually, I have only done 14, so I'm missing 2 other teams, which I'll take a quick look for, but I do believe I have gone through all of them. I may not have just said make it or break it. Yeah, this Bills one, for example. Oh, actually, you know what? I have not done. I apologize. I have not done this Bills one. This Bills one is interesting because the biggest thing about this Bills team is the fact that they had a true shot to make the playoffs or potentially even Super Bowl last year, and they had another kind of disappointing season, and they go and they say, hey, the reason why we were disappointing is because Sean McDermott couldn't get us past the hump. Now, do I agree with that? Yes and no. But then they go, hey, the guy that has been drafting our team for the last 3 to 4 years, who have been neglecting the fact that they have not been able to get talent for Josh Allen. Not only is he staying, but then we're doubling down and we're going to go ahead and promote Brandon Beane to the highest level in our front office. You look at Brandon Beane. This is a guy who, again and again, you look at these drafts and it's just significant misses. Most recently is, Keon Coleman is supposed to be your big one-on-one jump ball receiver, and he's had more situations where he's been too immature to make practice, or what has been, benched for games. They, as well as like free agency, they've had a issue of bringing in high-end free agents, and it's almost like they keep on just getting 1-year rentals. For example, last offseason, they bring in Joey Bosa on a 1-year deal, and he has a fantastic year. You are not expecting much from him, and he goes out there and leads the league in forced fumbles. So what do? Instead of re-signing the 1-year veteran that really was able to produce in your system, you let him go, and then you sign Bradley Chubb, who is another guy who's an older pass rusher that's dealt with injuries. So it's a situation where they are just kind of getting the same guys over and over again and just having Josh Allen do whatever he can do to win, except he doesn't really have that many weapons. James Cook is a fantastic running back, but I don't know how much more does Josh Allen really have. He is getting into the late 20s to early 30s range for a quarterback. And you kind of saw last year where his rushing ability, which is probably one of his best aspects of keeping the play alive, is kind of slowly declining. It's a quarterback ability that is not very long lasting. So it's against a situation where you just be like, okay, our issue with Sean McDermott, we're going to go ahead and fire him. And then it's definitely not me, Brandon Beane. I'm going to go ahead and promote myself because I've done such a fantastic job with this roster. When in reality, no, you haven't. So then it comes to the pressure meter. And I think, especially from a fan's perspective, the pressure meter has to be a 10 out of 10. If they don't succeed to being as good to being better than they were last year. Because if they are the same as last year, then it just goes to show that Sean McDermott wasn't the issue. It was Brandon Beane. I mean, the whole thing is they weren't able to get a head coach to come in, an outside head coach to come in because of him. They had to go and they had to promote someone internally in Joe Brady. So Brandon Beane, to me, has a 10 out of 10 pressure meter. And I think he folds. I think he breaks under pressure. I don't believe that Brandon Beane is going to be able to succeed with not only this pressure, but this roster, and just the fact that he's put all of this, he's put an scapegoat out there, and he has already used that ability. So I don't truly believe it's going to be a make it type of season for Brandon Beane. Lastly, we have one more team, and that is going to be the Chargers. I went back and forth with the Chargers strictly because everybody talks about Justin Herbert, and he's a guy that's been fantastic in the regular season, but again and again has shown up the inability to win meaningful playoff games. Partially that is, you could blame the offensive line. You can blame the lack of a running game. You can blame it on, the defense not playing well in the past, maybe wide receivers, weapons. So I'm looking outside of just Justin Herbert. I think that's the easy scapegoat, and I'm looking at other, potential just players. And the top one that comes to my mind is Ladd McConkey. As a rookie, Ladd McConkey was not only one of the best receivers and the best rookies, but he was truly that wide receiver one. Came out of Georgia, was a true breakout player. No one really expected this. And then in the following seasons, you bring in Quentin Johnston, Keenan Allen back in. You're expecting Ladd McConkey to completely dominate that slot area. And he comes in and he has maybe half the catches, under 700 yards, and half the touchdowns. Very similar to Brian Thomas Jr. So coming into this year, very similar to Brian Thomas Jr., I think the pressure is a little bit higher. I do think he sits around a 6 on the pressure rate because of Keenan Allen not being back on the team. Quentin Johnston is the one that ended up having the breakout season last year. And if Ladd McConkey's not able to come back to, how he played as a rookie, then you have real questions about who this wide receiver truly is. Or it could be the opposite. He could truly become one of the top end wide receivers for Justin Herbert if he's able to take off after this year. So I think you take away the fact that Keenan Allen is now off the team. You have a lot more open targets. I do think Ladd McConkey is able to come back to how he used to play as a rookie, and he does make it on the pressure meter. So with that being said, we have gone through all 16 of the AFC teams. I'll quickly kind of run through them real fast. We just talked about the Bills. Brandon Beane, I do think he is a break it when it comes to just the high pressure meter he has this upcoming season. He doesn't have any excuses as a general manager anymore, firing Sean McDermott. Dolphins don't really have too many players that are on the make or break. I put Zach Sealer almost strictly because of his age. So his pressure rate's not too high, but I do think he is off the team. I do think he is a disappointing season. Jets, Aaron Glenn, very clear. He's a defensive-minded head coach that led his team to absolutely 0 turnovers last year. Very high pressure rate. I do think he fails it. Patriots, Mike Vrabel. A lot of offseason drama. Pressure rate's right in the middle, but this is coming off a season where they just made it to the Super Bowl, and I do think he is fine, even with the high pressure rate. Ravens, Roquan Smith. This is not the all-pro that he once was. Do think his pressure rate's a little bit over half, but I do think almost strictly because of that contract, he does stay, and he is okay. Bengals, Zach Taylor. Again, you have no more scapegoats. Joe Burrow, regardless of if Joe Burrow is fully healthy or not, the Bengals don't make at least the divisional round, Zach Taylor's gone. And I do think he will not be back. Brown's kind of the same thing with Todd Monken. I just think the connection between the coach and the players has not been very beneficial up to now. Has led to a lot of disappointment when it comes to especially the defensive players. Potentially one of the main reasons why Myles Garrett requested a trade, as well as just the handling of the quarterback room. I do think it's a 10 out of 10 on the pressure meter. I don't think he is able to accept it. I think he breaks it. Steelers, TJ Watt, injuries, age, massive contract, as well as his own backups are getting paid very big contracts. I do think the pressure rate's very high, and I don't think he's able to sustain his previous dominancy. Texans, CJ Stroud, last year of his contract, high pressure rate because he is supposed to be this, big time quarterback. He's had high highs, low lows. I do think he ends up getting a new contract by the Texans, even though I do think there'll be times where it's going to be big discussions. Colts, Shane Steichen, he's had a very up and down tenure as the Colts head coach. Showed a lot of promise last year with his offensive scheme. Between injuries and just the fact that it kind of became redundant, it took a massive hit. And because of that, I think his pressure meter coming into the season is pretty high. I don't think he makes it. Brian Thomas Jr., this one just was a very disappointing sophomore year as a wide receiver. Dealt with a few injuries, drops. I think comes into the season with about a medium pressure meter because he is not necessarily that wide receiver one anymore. I do think his usage is a little bit different than his rookie year. And last year, I think he becomes more of that down the field playmaker. So I do think he makes it because of that. Titans, Jermaine Johnson, you traded for him this offseason. He's on a 1-year contract. He's supposed to be one of your best edge rushers. I do think his pressure rate's not too extreme high because the expectations behind him aren't necessarily the biggest. Even with that, I do think injuries play a big part, and I don't necessarily think he is the player he once was. Therefore, I do think he is a breakout candidate. Chiefs, Xavier Worthy has just been disappointing. He's not been the Tyreek Hill replacement they've thought. I think he comes in with decent pressure meter, a little bit above average. I do think he breaks it. Lad McConkey, very similar. He comes in as a rookie, dominates last year as a sophomore. Very disappointing. Obviously, part of that is not as many targets towards him. This year, he's an opportunity again to get, a lot more targets. And I do think he makes it. The pressure meter, Chargers, incredible roster. Riley Moss, to me, has that pressure rate because at times last year, he was the weak point. It was very easy to see where teams were targeting on defense. So because of that, he does have a lot of pressure going into the season if he can sustain to even develop more into his game. And because of that, I do think he is a break candidate. I don't think he can necessarily play up to the pressure and up to what he truly is. Lastly, it is the Raiders. And my, make or break candidate is Ashton Genty. To me, the pressure is a little bit higher, but just because the idea that he had a very disappointing rookie year and there's been history of Raiders running backs kind of being very disappointing, I do think he ends up he comes out and makes it strictly because rookie quarterback, so you are going to tend on the run game more, as well as you bring in the offense coordinator for the team that had the highest running percentage last year, who also won the Super Bowl. So I do think he's going to be fine. I do think he makes it. But yeah, that is kind of everything for today. Next week, I am going to come back with the NFC South. I apologize, the NFC, and kind of go through my make or break candidates over there. But without further ado, thank you everyone for tuning in, and I will see y'all next time.